It's another beautiful Sunday afternoon. This is Rubbin Minds. Welcome. My name is Ebuka Obiuchi, and thanks a lot for joining us. It's a brand new week for Nigerians, and a lot of people are wondering what this week will bring, considering how active and, what, for want of a better word, dramatic the presidency of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has been with regards to policy changes and people being relieved of their jobs and all of that. We're still expecting news about, the list of cabinet members. We do know that based on resolutions. Based on the promises that he has made. He said he would hit the ground running. It looks like he's done that, but the government also needs to hit the ground running, and we're hoping that the week to come gives us some idea as to what the shape of the government will be looking like. We're going to be looking at the new government and its policies so far. I'm joined here in the studio by Timi Olagunju, who's a policy consultant and lawyer. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
What a couple of weeks we've had, man. I think from the very first day of the inauguration, things just started, flying from there.
Yeah.
On the day, subsidy was removed, and we thought that would be it, but it looks like every other day there's something new. Is this healthy, though? Because we do know that when governments change, things like this kind of happen. This seems to be different, from it. I think the last time we probably had something like this was when Obasanjo came in, because that was a strong departure from the military. Do you think this is too much too soon, or do you think it's actually what we needed, considering how most people have felt about the last 8 years?
Let's give a background to the entire election, which is the fact that the election that birthed Mr. Tinubu as president is an election that is considered, in terms of numbers, the least popular. He got the least popular votes since the inception of the presidential system of government in Nigeria, since 1979. He got the least popular votes that got him into the presidency. And by virtue of that, one can imagine that, there's so much point to prove in order to win the popular view as to what the presidency stands for. However, the road to hell can be littered with a lot of good intentions. And particularly when you look at the fact that when it comes to policy is a circle, right? And you need to consider something called the policy environment. And to a large extent, some people have been of the view that the entire policy framework, whether from the students' loan, straight down to other policy frameworks, show some level of heel preparedness in terms of its policy framework. For instance, the Student Loan Act that was passed is not a new invention. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat same. In 1972, thereabout, there was the Student Loan Board. And subsequently, after the formation in the 1970s, we had a situation where the loans, there was widespread corruption. That was the first key issue in 1970s. And also the issue of the fact that students also had the challenge of increase in tuition fee, right? And after that board was inaugurated in the 1970s and led to massive protests. And so we hope this particular act, the Student Loan Act, does not become a foundation for the justification for increased student fees, tuition fees, as we've seen in the past.
Yeah, let me cut you in there, because that's what a lot of people think that means now. Because we started seeing headlines even coming after about, government completely withdrawing subsidy on education, which of course means that prices, tuition fees are going to go up. But we've also seen Mr. President, I think I saw a picture sometime this week with him meeting some executives of NANS, National Association of Nigerian Students. So it looks like he's trying to, reach out properly. We've seen that happen with the subsidy. We had threats of protest from the NLC, ended up not happening. Don't you give him some credit for, how he seems to be pulling off these policies and also assuaging those who need to be assuaged? Not saying that students are going to protest or not, but if he's saying he's going to provide loans and may most likely, withdraw subsidy on education, and he's also having conversations with NANS, isn't that the right way to go about it? Because government can't afford a lot of these things anymore, if we're being honest.
Well, the truth is this. What government cannot afford is subsidizing the lifestyle of politicians. And that is That's the key point. Now,
Well, that too.
when we talk about the context of the act itself, you see that in terms of its practicality, it begs of practicality. For example, $500,000 household income. It's not saying a single parent earning $500,000 a year. It's saying household income, which includes father, mother, the family, earning 500,000 naira a year. That's approximately around 40,000, right? In a month for an entire family. So for someone to be eligible to the loan, you're saying that the person's parents must be earning around 40,000 thereabouts as salary per month or income.
About 1,500 or 2,000 naira a day.
You see, so practically, when you look at that, it begs of practicality. And also, when you look at the context of the entire framework, people have talked about imprisonments and the likes. But the context I want to even take it from is the context of Section 18, subsection 3 of the Constitution. You know, when you talk about fundamental objectives and directives of state principle, where you talk about the fact that the Constitution provides that one of the key duties of government is to ensure free education from primary to tertiary institution, right? So in other words, hopefully this particular act does not impugn or pierce through the constitutionality of a laid down framework in the Constitution. You know, so those are key issues. Hope it doesn't bet on unconstitutionality, because the key agenda of government, as is spelled out in the Constitution, that purportedly brought this Mr. Tinubu into office, right, states that the government must make its effort towards free education from primary to tertiary education.
You know, the issue of this education thing, I feel like it's something we need an entire show to discuss. One, because the progressives have always touted themselves as people who are very big on education. We haven't seen a lot of that in the last 8 years, but you know, it's one of the mantras that, if you look back in history, not necessarily the APC now, but the progressive movement in Nigeria has always been very big on, you know, free education and things along those lines. So it'll be nice to see how that evolves. And I want to quickly move on because there's a lot to cover. Let's talk about, you know, the Naira now, and you know how this shock came again, I think, during the week about, you know, the CBN putting out this statement and saying, you know what, it's now floating. You know, I feel like that word trended for 2 days. People trying to understand what a floating Naira looks like, you know. And the Naira has just been going all over the place. He hit 664, went to 790, went to 701. Nobody seems to understand what's happening there. But that's also one thing that a lot of people have sort of advocated for. No country exists properly with two exchange rates. And we've had that for decades now. Was it not time to do it? And don't you just pull off the Band-Aid the way he did? Or was there a different way to have done it?
Well, like I said earlier, you know, in the commencement of our conversation, that the road to hell can sometimes be littered with good intentions, right? And so, before now, right, since 2016, right, Nigeria has operated a managed floating rates. So in other words, it's not as if the word floating is just a new thing now. We've operated a managed floating rate, which means at some point there is a certain free market, and then at some point, the CBN comes in to intervene, right? So in itself, when you look at the peculiarity of the Nigerian situation, it's important that, yes, we move towards, you know, a floating rate that is dictated by demand and supply. But the core challenge for us is, can't it be gradual? And that's the key thing here. And this is quite important because, you see, when you talk about the context of policy making, right, it's very important that you also look at beyond just the economy of finance. It's also important to look at the economy of the basic Maslow's hierarchy of need: food, clothing, shelter. At a critical time as this, when Nigerians are bedeviled with the issues that they are, and poverty has risen sporadically, right? So what do you leave Nigerians as? So the context should have been a gradual process, a gradual facing into a full-fledged floating rather than an instant approach. And when you look at it contextually, some persons have argued that, you know, demand and supply, right, key issues. But when you look at the policy documents, which I read through, towards the end of the policy document released by the CBN, they suspended two things. two things that have contributed significantly to influx of dollar supply. And you remember there's the BT 2000 or 200 policy. And then there's the Naira for dollar policy, right? Which is to end by the end of June. Those key policies are key policies that have driven a supply of foreign exchange into Nigeria. You remember that when that policy was instituted, before then, right, there was a challenge with people in the diaspora sending money in. Because when you send money through Western Union, you get it in Naira. You remember that time? Then they came in with the policy that, look, we are going back to, once you send it in, you get dollar, and then you get a 20 Naira on each dollar that you send in. And so those kind of incentives, I felt that should have been part of the package. And that's the challenge with hurriedly making policies instantly rather than gradually facing it through. The second part, which has to do with imports, right? The BT 200 policy, which is that for every dollar that you bring into Nigeria due to exports, right, you get 65 Naira. Those are key policies. The core challenge is not a challenge of policies. We have policies in Nigeria. The core challenge is a challenge of implementation, the challenge of corruption.
Are you worried that, a lot of these things have happened without a cabinet in place? We don't have a minister. The CBN governor has been suspended. I will have an acting governor, but, it looks like, yes, he's now appointed a special advisor on monetary policies or whatever it is. And, him taking on this alone without a team sort of properly assembled, is it a worry, or is it still early days?
Well, I would have, to make an excuse for Mr. Tinubu, I would argue that perhaps they had these things in plan, in their campaign team before coming on board. But then the challenge there is the fact that, when you look at the context of how these things are done, there's been challenges about the legality or illegality of the suspension of the CBN governor, right? But those are subjects for the court to determine. But in the context of my own personal perspective, I would say that Mr. Tinubu should toe the line of Yar'Adua's sincerity. When Yar'Adua came into office, he stated clearly that the elections that brought him into office were fraughted with irregularities. And that was the level of sincerity that won the Nigerian people. If Mr. Tinubu wants to win the heart of Nigerians, as it seems that the whole policy approach is at the moment, he needs to look beyond just, suspending the CBN governor, suspending MAGU, that's the EFCC, but also looking into accepting that the elections that brought him into office, as against the speech that he stated that it was fair, were fraughted with irregularity and ensured the suspension of the INEC chairman as well. That's a fair game.
But if the case is still in court, like we know, the election tribunal is still sitting on these issues, isn't it sub judice for him to make any statements with regards to the elections? Yar'Adua could have said that at a time when he had won fair and square or whatever it is in court.
That's a fair point. I perfectly agree with your positioning on that. But it's rather better not to say that it was a free and fair election. Rather than say it was.
You mentioned the legality or not of the suspension of the CBN governor. Also, the EFCC chairman Bawa also has been suspended. So these moves as well. People keep referencing Sanusi back in 2011, 2012, when the same thing happened with him being kicked out and all of that. Do you think that has set a precedent that has made it right? Because a court case was put there, but it never went all the way to the Supreme Court, so nobody knows.
Even the Court of Appeal, never went as far.
What the precedent really is. And now, should Emefiele go to court? Is this the way forward for the independence of the CBN?
No. And that's the danger with precedents. I wish that it had proceeded towards going beyond just the Federal High Court. Because since the Federal High Court's decision, it becomes, somewhat law until it is appealed against in the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. And then after the Supreme Court, any other appeal goes to God, the divine one. So the point there is the fact that the precedent is not a desirable one, considering the fact that, you see, if we are not careful, this kind of precedents, particularly with the way the CBN is being managed, or the way the CBN is constructed, will go further to giving the presidency the powers of both fiscal and monetary policy, right? Fiscal policy, apparently, the Ministry of Finance, which is residual in the powers of the president, has that capacity. But monetary policy also is quite key and delicate. So there is a reason why the financial gurus that built the institutions of the CBN and the Ministry of Finance, right, built those institutions so that there is room for some level of checks and balance between fiscal and monetary policy. And you know, the problem with politicians also is the fact that, like I said, and I repeat, the road to hell can be littered with a lot of good intentions. And sometimes you cannot really say that the intentions of politicians are 100% pure. And so it is dangerous to leave the capacity, the powers, the independence of the CBN to the whims and caprice of the president. The CBN as it stands, I'm sure the staff of the CBN and the experts at the CBN are operating under fear or tension, and it is unacceptable.
Yeah. I mean, I honestly hope a lot of this, you know, things we're seeing now end up in our courts so that at least we understand what to do, what the position really is, because a lot of us are confused now. Is this how, you know, things are going to play out? But just moving away a little from the presidency, we did see new leadership in the legislature as well during the week. Both this new speaker and the new Senate president are very strong allies of Mr. President. You know, a lot of people are having sort of PTSD from a couple of years ago when it looked like they became a rubber stamp of the presidency. On the one hand, some people say it's good for the president to have his people at the helm of affairs there. It makes policies move, you know, very smoothly, but then it also sort of prevents the checks and balances which the legislature is supposed to bring. How are you feeling about the 10th National Assembly and the way things have started shaping up there?
The 10th National Assembly is an interesting one.
Yeah. It's an uncommon one.
It's uncommon. Okay. So, well, let me take a cue from your word uncommon, you know. So, but then the thing is the fact that the 10th National Assembly, for instance, two-third majority quorum was not met by the APC at the Senate, right? And so it means that it will be a lot of challenge for them to pass, you know, bills that require two-third majority, and would involve a lot of, you know, consultation and, you know, engagement of the other stakeholders in PDP, in Labour Party, and other stakeholders from other parties. So that's a good thing. Very good. At the House of Representatives, we have some level of, you know, majority for the APC as it stands, but then
a slight one.
It's a slight one, but the Senate is even, you know, much more. And so what you have in that situation is the fact that you have at the House of Reps also a diverse parliamentary constitution, which means that increasingly there will be room for debate and counter debates across the various interests involved. And that's a good thing in itself. That's a good thing. But I think that the president is lucky. Mr. Tinubu is a lucky man. And the reason is simple. He has successfully installed a leadership that will play ball with his legislative agenda. And also remember that he has a former Speaker of the House of Representatives as his Chief of Staff, which means that legislative ease, it will be a very key benefit of his tenure. And hopefully, that can be a basis upon which to drive not just policies that are focused on the economic side of revenue generation, as we've seen it with Lagos, No. But are focused on pro-people, the human side and angle, as propagated by people like the Awolowos who started off free education. Where did they get the money to do those things? They could as well as claim that there was no money. Or the Jack Condays of this world who revived public education, right? And so that is the challenge. The challenge is that there might be an increasingly pro-revenue economic agenda as against a pro-people agenda. And we mustn't mix it all up.
Fair enough. Just before we wrap up now, I'm trying to just wrap my head around, because we did see a lot of his manifesto before he came into office. Like I said, there's still the election tribunal, which is sitting concurrently with his presidency going on. I wonder, a lot of us have thought that the APC had sort of leaned towards socialist agenda. It's looking these days like, things are going to be a clear departure from what it looked like, the welfareist policies that the last presidency had. I know Mr. President now has mentioned a few things here and there. I mean, the student loans can be called one of those welfareist policies, but generally, a lot of the policies of the APC now look different from what it was. Political ideology in Nigeria, does it exist? Because it's just very interesting to me.
The answer is no.
Yeah.
As it stands, no. But hopefully it should. And it should be a people-centered political ideology. And the reason is simple. You see, you cannot get revenue from a population that is poor. Rather, they will fight back.
Yeah.
That's the reality, right? And so it's quite important that the APC gets its act together and begin to look beyond just revenue generation into a pro-people policy. And hopefully also, on a personal note, Mr. Tinubu started up the one-day governor in Lagos State. Hopefully, we can also have a government where there is an institutionalization of fellowships and internships at Aso Rock. How many Nigerian kids or youths have been privileged to even visit or even know how Aso Rock looks or what the operations are there? So we can have at the parliamentary level, at the executive level, some institutionalization of a fellowship and internship program for
just
young
sort of
people.
Bringing government closer to the people.
Exactly, who have distinguished themselves at the community level. I'm a privileged beneficiary of the Mandela Washington Fellowship in 2015 by President Barack Obama, right? And interestingly, we've not had any of such. And it's based on the community work that I've been doing here in Nigeria. So you see that you cannot build institutionalization of a pro-people leadership if you do not understand the places of institutionalizing fellowships and internships for young people who have distinguished themselves in little.
Looking at this list of special advisors that have been appointed now, does it give you any hope? Because one of the things that were touted during the campaign season was that Tinubu has always been able to assemble a great team. As governor, he killed it for a lot of people. Like, he did a great job, with the team he assembled. A lot of them have gone on to do other things, in the political space. Looking at the 12 names that I believe that have come out from Mr. President, impressed, excited, hopeful for, what this government might look like?
Well, they are special advisors, and their capacity starts and ends in advisory. It takes Mr. Tinubu to accept the advice or not. But let's go back to football a bit. When you look at the constitution of a great team in a football match, without a goal itself, or with a goal that is not focused on a certain, that is not pro-people or pro-victory, whatever victory is, right, cannot deliver the desires of the expectations of whatever the fans are, right? It's not about assembling alone. It's also about what are the core tenets and ideology that drives the government. Like I said, is it just revenue generation, like we've seen in Lagos, or a pro-people ideology, basic hierarchies of needs, food, clothing, shelter, as well as other things that fall into that category. So those are the key things that we need to look at now. But I must commend that the special advisors are seemingly square peg in square hole, right? But they're advisory. And I'm hoping that, much more importantly, at the executive level, you don't consider the advisors as significant as the ministers, and which is what you mentioned earlier about the need for a ministry that is not the same as the previous administration that was hijacked by governors, where you had ministers. How many governors became ministers? Who could have been statesmen to have collected that same portfolio and said, look, let's look for much younger, much capable female or male that can do this job, rather than take the job to themselves. And it still boils down to the fact that we need to subsidize. We need to stop subsidizing the cost of governance. That's a key point there.
Let's just quickly wrap up this conversation now, because the subsidy thing was talked about heavily by, I think, most of the candidates during the campaign. So it's something I feel like Nigerians sort of expected. The Buhari government had said it was going to go away in June. They had put that in place already. You know, the current president also talked about, you know, this FX thing, you know, that's he was sort of going to pull off. But what do you want to see from this government, or from whatever government, if the courts decide otherwise, you know, in the coming weeks, months of Nigeria's life? Because the world is going through it. We're seeing economic growth in a lot of places either stalled or slowed down heavily, which Nigeria, of course, has been a part of. We saw the inflation numbers reach another all-time high in Nigeria. What do you want to see happen in the coming weeks and months to sort of assuage people's fears? Because a lot of us are scared now with this FX thing that's happened. What are the price of things going to be? Fuel subsidy has been removed. What are the price of things going to be? Can we afford anything? Nobody's talking about increasing salaries at this point. You know, what do you want to see from a government?
One time very respected leader said that a leader is a dealer in hope. And so, for example, I would have expected that Mr. Tinubu's speech would not have contained that part that talked about removal of subsidy, because that was the basis of a lot of a mess that happened in terms of petrol increase of prices and all that. The truth was the fact that the subsidy was not even in the budget. It had been removed already. You know, so if it wasn't contained in the budget, there was no basis for whooping up that sentiment. And that's my challenge, that's my worry, that a lot of ill-thought speeches and ill-thought policies that might be good in themselves but not appropriate at the time might be the landmark or legacy of this government. And hopefully they work towards that. But most importantly, what I hope to see is a country, you know, in Nigeria, where the burden of the seismic shift, the desirable change or progressive change that Nigerians desire does not just come from the sacrifice of Nigerians, because Nigerians have sacrificed a lot already, but it comes from the sacrifice of those in government, politicians who have been voted in, whether at the executive or at the parliamentary level, that they start to see how to ensure that they cut the cost of governance and perhaps start to consider serving the Nigerian people for half their salaries or for free.
Is that realizable, though? I mean, we know we've talked about this, you know, the salaries of legislators for years now. It's never happened. We also have a new president now who most people do not have faith in when it comes to, you know, money matter. Because, you know, he's been accused of so many things we're not going to necessarily go into now. But, you know, do you see this government sort of putting their feet down to say, okay, let's cut costs, government costs? Recurrent expenditure has always been the biggest problem from state governments to the federal. That just eats up the budget. Do you think that's really going to happen?
Frankly, I don't. Because, and this is the reason, evidence is the end of argument. And the evidence that we've seen in the last 20 days in office, I believe, 20 days in office, has only shown to shift the sacrifice and the burden to Nigerians. But we've not seen a reciprocal shift of the burden or sacrifice on the government or politicians. And that is something we need to look at carefully. right? Reciprocity is reciprocal. If you expect Nigerians to sacrifice, and then you must show some commitment towards it. So the evidence on ground, but the only permanent thing is change. Like Ariklati said, you can't step into a moving river twice. So hopefully there might be change in the coming days or weeks that shows the tenacity of Mr. President, Mr. Tinubu himself, towards cutting the cost of governance significantly and also reducing human interaction when it comes to issues around finance. Because, technology has shown to have provided some leeway towards stemming the tide of corruption, particular corruption that has bedeviled us for how many years. And as simple as the technology TSA, remember Treasury Single Account, and BVN, those simple technological framework or innovation had significant ripple effect on stemming the tide of corruption in those key areas. And so I think going forward, we need to employ more of that blockchain technology and all those kind of innovation towards cutting the cost of governance, reducing human interface and interaction on finance-related public finance, and driving innovative governance going forward.
Just very quick one, please.
Yes.
In one sentence or two, because you're a lawyer, I just wanted to get your thoughts on Senator Bulkachua and what he said about, his wife and all of that. What do you think that says? Because there's already concerns about, confidence in the judiciary. We have a presidential election tribunal thing going on. And, we're hearing it's seen a spate of suspensions and all of that. What should happen there?
You can see that even my response is the same response that had elicited from the Senate president at that time, where he told him to please don't go there. And that is the landing phase for me to say that what he has stated is a reason to now go there. And by going there, going into inquiry in more Senate claims, going into inquiry as to the cases that has been handled under her leadership, because it's a very big,
heavy indictment,
very heavy, from your better half.
Bold case.
from your better half.
I couldn't believe what I was watching. It still is very shocking.
So it is, and that onus falls on the Supreme Court. It falls on the Supreme Court to restore the integrity of the judiciary. Which
Thank
is
you
the
very
hope of
much,
the common
Timi
man.
Olagunju. I feel like it's going to be very interesting here. Whoever is, we have a new president. The policies are already looking very, very fascinating to a lot of people. Hopefully, Nigerians can stay strong enough to hold it tight. But of course, you'll come back. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for having me.